In the 1870s, Boston, a boy with a scarred eye terrified an entire city. He was only 14 years old. The newspapers called him the boy fiend, and parents warned their children never to walk alone. His name was Jesse Harding Pomeroy, and his story became one of the most disturbing examples of violent crime committed by someone so young. People still ask how a child could have committed such acts, and whether his punishment was justice or something else entirely. Jesse was born on November 29, 1859, in Charlestown, Massachusetts. He grew up in a working-class family with his mother Ruth Ann, father Thomas, and an older brother. Life at home was not easy. His father was known for having a harsh temper, and discipline in the household could be severe. From a young age, Jesse's appearance set him apart. He had a white scar over his right eye, the result of an illness, which made his gaze unusual. Other children often stared or kept their distance, something Jesse would later say made him feel angry and unwanted. By the time Jesse was 12 years old, in 1871, strange incidents began to happen in the neighborhoods of South Boston. Boys as young as 4 or 5 years old were returning home with injuries and stories about an older boy who lured them away. He would promise to show them a shortcut or offer to play a game, but instead, he would take them to quiet, out-of-the-way spots and hurt them. Several children described him as tall for his age, thin, with dark hair and a noticeable mark over one eye. Some even said he smiled when he spoke, as if trying to seem friendly before things turned frightening. The assaults continued for months, each one adding to the growing fear in the community. Parents began escorting their children to school and watching them closely at play. The police had little to go on, but they began to suspect the attacker was a young teenager, not an adult. On December 4th, 1871, after another boy came forward with details, police identified and arrested Jesse Pomeroy. At only 12 years old, he was charged with multiple counts of assault. Because of his age, the court decided not to send him to a regular prison. Instead, on February 22, 1872, he was sentenced to the Massachusetts House of Reformation, an institution meant to correct the behavior of troubled youth. Jesse was supposed to remain there until he turned 21, but after only a year and a half, the board decided to release him early. On February 6, 1874, at the age of 14, Jesse returned home to live with his mother in South Boston. Many believed the worst was behind him, but within weeks of his release, the city would face something even more alarming. On March 18, 1874, a 10-year-old girl named Katie Curran was reported missing by her family. She had left home that afternoon to buy a notebook at a local shop, but never returned. The last confirmed sighting of Katie placed her near a small store operated by Jesse's mother. There were no signs of where she went after that, and despite her family's desperate search, no trace of her was found at the time. Just 3 weeks later, on April 22, 1874, another child disappeared. This time, a 4-year-old boy named Horace Millen from the Chelsea neighborhood, just across the river from Boston. That morning, Horace was seen walking along the beach with a teenage boy who matched Jesse's description. Later that day, Horace's body was found, and the nature of the injuries left no doubt that this was a deliberate killing. The police now had a name and a face in mind, and the city of Boston was about to see one of the youngest murder suspects in its history brought into custody. Jesse was arrested later that same day, April 22, 1874. When officers brought him in, they noticed his clothing was damp and had small stains that raised their suspicions. During questioning, Jesse spoke calmly and gave a version of events that shifted several times. At first, he denied knowing Horace at all. Then he admitted seeing the boy on the beach, but claimed they had only talked. When the officers pressed him with details from witnesses, he hesitated, then said the boy had hurt himself while playing. His explanations did not match the evidence. The police began to look more closely at Jesse's activities since his early release from the reformatory. They learned that he often spent time alone, wandering through different parts of the city. Several residents remembered seeing him near schools, playgrounds, and along the shoreline. As they compared statements, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Jesse was often seen in the same places where children later went missing or were harmed. Investigators then turned their attention back to the disappearance of Katie Curran. Her case had gone cold in the weeks after she was last seen, but now a connection seemed possible. The fact that she was last spotted near the store run by Jesse's mother was impossible to ignore. Police searched the store carefully, moving goods, checking the storeroom, and looking for anything unusual. In the basement, they noticed areas where the dirt floor looked disturbed. Though nothing was immediately recovered, the officers recorded their findings and kept the location in mind for further investigation. Meanwhile, the evidence in the case of Horace Millen was enough to bring formal charges. The court proceedings in May 1874 drew intense public attention. Newspapers printed Jesse's age, appearance, and family details on their front pages. The idea that a 14-year-old could be accused of such a crime shocked people across Massachusetts. Some believed he was too young to fully understand what he had done. Others argued that his past behavior showed he was dangerous and needed to be removed from society permanently. During the trial for Horace's death, witnesses testified about seeing Jesse lead the boy toward the beach and then returning alone. Medical experts described the injuries in cautious terms suitable for the court, avoiding unnecessary detail, but making clear the act had been intentional. Jesse's calm expression throughout the proceedings unsettled many in the courtroom. He did not seem nervous or remorseful, and he rarely reacted to what was being said about him. The jury found Jesse guilty of first-degree murder on December 10, 1874. Under the law at the time, that verdict carried a mandatory death sentence. However, the fact that Jesse was only 14 created a legal and moral dilemma. Executing someone so young was extremely rare in the United States, and the governor of Massachusetts soon faced pressure to commute the sentence. After months of public debate, the decision was made in August 1876 to reduce the punishment from death to life in prison. Jesse would spend the rest of his days in confinement, but the case of Katie Curran was still officially unsolved, and that would change only years later. In 1876, while Jesse was already serving his life sentence, a change came in the case of Katie Curran. The small store his mother had once operated in South Boston was being renovated. Workers clearing out the basement came across a grim discovery: the remains of a young girl. The location matched exactly where police had noticed disturbed soil during their earlier search, but at the time, they had not dug deeply enough to uncover anything. The clothing and small items found with the remains were identified by Katie's family as belonging to her. Although years had passed since her disappearance on March 18, 1874, the discovery confirmed what many had suspected, that Katie's fate had been tied to Jesse Pomeroy all along. With this evidence, investigators believed they could finally connect Jesse to both murders, but he was already serving a life sentence. Charging him again would not change his punishment. Still, the finding was reported widely in newspapers, reinforcing his reputation as one of the most dangerous offenders in Massachusetts history. The public reaction was a mixture of sadness for Katie's family and renewed anger toward Jesse, especially because the opportunity to prevent her death had been lost when he was released early from the reformatory. In prison, Jesse's life took on a very different shape from that of most inmates. At first, he was held in regular confinement at the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown. Over time, as he grew older, his conditions became more restrictive. By his mid-20s, he was moved into solitary confinement, where he would remain for decades. He was allowed limited exercise and reading material, but had no contact with other prisoners. Prison officials believed that keeping him isolated was the safest choice for both the staff and the inmate population. Despite the isolation, Jesse managed to educate himself. He read extensively and even studied languages, claiming to have learned to read in several different ones. He wrote letters to the press, to government officials, and to anyone he thought might help his case. Beginning in the late 1800s and continuing well into the 20th century, Jesse filed repeated petitions for release or transfer to less severe conditions. Each time, the authorities reviewed his record and denied the request, citing the seriousness of his crimes and the public's strong opposition to any change in his sentence. Over the years, Jesse became something of a curiosity in the press. Articles would occasionally appear describing the boy killer who had entered prison as a teenager and grown into an old man without ever leaving. Some reporters were granted limited interviews in which Jesse would discuss his reading, his view of the legal system, and his insistence that he had not committed all of the acts attributed to him. Even so, he never convinced the public or officials to see him as anything other than a dangerous man who had taken the lives of 2 children. By the early 1900s, Jesse Pomeroy had been in prison for more than 25 years. The boy, who had once walked the streets of Boston with a scar over his right eye, was now a middle-aged man, known throughout the state as one of its most infamous inmates. His solitary confinement continued year after year, with only rare medical examinations or brief walks in a prison yard breaking the routine. Reports from prison officials described him as polite and orderly, but deeply withdrawn. In 1914, after 4 decades behind bars, Jesse made another formal request for his sentence to be reconsidered. This time, his petition was supported by some reform advocates who believed that no one, especially someone imprisoned as a child, should be kept in such extreme isolation for life. The Massachusetts governor and parole board reviewed his case, but public opinion was firmly against him. Families of the victims and many citizens argued that the nature of his crimes showed he could never be safely released. Once again, his request was denied. As the years went on, Jesse's health began to decline. Prison doctors noted signs of physical weakness and poor eyesight, but he remained mentally alert. He continued to read extensively and corresponded with a small number of supporters, often discussing legal arguments and his own view of justice. In the 1920s, he was transferred from the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown to the Bridgewater State Hospital, a facility for mentally ill inmates. Here, his conditions were somewhat less harsh, though he still lived under close supervision. Jesse's final years were quiet compared to the storm his name once stirred in Boston. He spent his days reading, writing letters, and speaking occasionally with staff. The man who had entered prison as a teenager lived to see the end of the First World War, the Roaring Twenties, and the Great Depression, all from inside an institution. On September 29, 1932, Jesse Pomeroy died at the age of 72. He had spent 58 years in custody, most of it in solitary conditions. His death was reported in newspapers across Massachusetts, with headlines recalling the crimes that had made him notorious. For many, his passing marked the end of one of the state's most disturbing criminal cases. Even after his death, the questions surrounding his life and crimes did not disappear. Historians and criminologists continued to debate whether Jesse had been born with violent tendencies or shaped by his upbringing and the conditions of his time. His case was cited in discussions about juvenile justice, with some arguing it proved that children could commit crimes as serious as any adult, while others saw it as an example of how early intervention might prevent tragedy. The story of Jesse Pomeroy remains a part of Boston's history more than a century later. It is remembered not only for the harm done to his young victims, but also for the way it challenged ideas about youth, punishment, and whether someone so young could ever truly change. Even with Jesse Pomeroy's death in 1932, his case has never fully faded from public memory. For some, it is remembered as a warning about what can happen when violent behavior in young offenders is underestimated. For others, it is a story about a justice system struggling to decide what to do when someone so young commits acts that defy understanding. More than 140 years later, Historians still revisit the events of 1874, studying court records, newspaper articles, and prison archives to piece together how and why Jesse's life unfolded the way it did. One of the lasting questions is whether Jesse's crimes were the result of something in his nature that could never have been changed, or whether they might have been prevented with better intervention. His early assaults in 1871 showed a clear pattern, yet the decision to release him from the reformatory in 1874 gave him the chance to commit the acts that would define his life. Critics have often pointed to this as a failure of judgment, while others note that at the time, the belief in reforming troubled youth was stronger than it is in some circles today. There are also unanswered details about the days leading up to the deaths of Katie Curran and Horace Millen. Jesse never gave a full and consistent account, and without modern investigative tools, some facts may have been lost forever. While the discovery of Katie's remains confirmed what many suspected, the lack of direct evidence beyond her connection to Jesse has left room for speculation. His long life in custody, much of it spent in solitary conditions, also raises difficult questions about the balance between punishment, safety, and humane treatment. The case still sparks debate among legal scholars and criminologists who use it to examine the boundaries of juvenile justice. Should someone under the age of 15 ever face the same sentence as an adult for crimes of this nature? Was the decision to keep Jesse isolated for so long the right one, or was it another kind of sentence entirely? These questions do not have simple answers, and perhaps that is why the story of Jesse Pomeroy continues to be discussed. More than a century later, the name Jesse Pomeroy still appears in books, lectures, and historical crime studies. His life, his crimes, and his punishment remain a complicated part of American legal history. Was he a young man who could never have been reformed, or a product of circumstances that shaped him in ways no one could repair? That is for each person to decide. What do you think? Was the system too willing to believe in reform before 1874, or too unwilling to consider it afterward? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more carefully researched stories from the darker side of history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case.